steam locomotives were built in England in 1804 as a result of a bet that they couldn't be done. Ever since then, the iron horse has sparked the imaginations of lovers of speed and beauty. In its heyday, some 30,000 would crisscross America. Today, only about 1,800 remain. We're about to meet the best of the survivors at Rail Fair, a grand celebration of railroading. This is a story about power, real horsepower. It's also about a man's fascination with engines, the kind of engines that can power a machine down the track at speeds that seem impossible. But the engines we're talking about aren't powered by nitromethane. They're powered by steam.
A steam engine is a living thing.
Things are alive and breathing.
It's an almost mystical sight, eerie, shrouded in steam, a ghost-like reminder of an era not that long ago. A time when the wail of a whistle and the clang of a bell and the chug, chug, chug of big steel wheels helped change our world.
The steam locomotive had a profound impact on the way we live. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 shortened the time that we could travel across the country. Previously, it took several weeks traveling overland behind a covered wagon or months by sailing ship around the tip of South America. So it was possible to get from coast to coast in only 7 days. Just think of it.
They're really representative of the golden industrial era of this country.
It was the era of the iron horse. Our population would begin to shift as the trains carried settlers to new homes across the country. With new markets and speedier delivery, agriculture and industry would soon boom. The railroad was an artery carrying America's lifeblood from coast to coast. The steam locomotive provided the heartbeat.
You have to concentrate or be tuned in, if you will, to the machine and listening to it and listening to what it's telling you and giving it what it needs to make it work its best. You're constantly listening to the stack and the rods and all that, and you really kind of have to become a part of it to make it perform right.
While the railroad changed America, it was in England where the revolution began, and it began simply with engines like this one, a replica of the British engine locomotion, first built in 1825 to haul coal from the mines.
But it was so successful that people wanted to ride behind it, so they built a passenger coach, and it became the first public passenger carrying railway in the world.
Before anything in America?
Before anything in America. It's actually a very primitive design, and the real breakthrough in design came in 1929 with Rocket. That was the first of the modern steam engines, and they all more or less stem from that.
The Tom Thumb is a replica of what was actually the first locomotive in the United States. Technically, it would be a 022. It's a small vertical boiler locomotive, very typical of early American practice. Right now it weighs about 13,000 pounds. So nearly as we can tell, develops about 3/4 of a horsepower. It can barely get itself over the road, much less pull a long train. But this, like the original, was a demonstration piece. It's got a tiny little 4-inch bore cylinder, a mystery valve gear. We're still not sure how it works, much less what kind of valve gear it has. But it's very sparing on coal. We could probably go 20 miles on a box of coal and a barrel of water. Lafayette. The original Lafayette was the first locomotive on the B&O with a horizontal boiler, as opposed to the vertical boiler engines that the B&O was so fond of. Even in the 1830s, the B&O was idiosyncratic, somewhat quirky in its choice of motive power. As the first horizontal boiler locomotive, it was a pioneer. It was a demonstration piece for the B&O. They liked it. Used almost its entire life between Baltimore and Washington.
And so our love affair with big engines was to begin. A combination of fire and water and emerging technology unleashed a power unlike any man had ever seen that would drive the heavy metal monsters that were to come. The Union Pacific 844 weighed nearly 500,000 pounds and pulled a host of cars behind it. Its power came from steam. Fire and water proved pretty potent.
Steam locomotives weren't rated on horsepower, they were rated on tractive effort, and that's how much pulling power it applies at the rail. 844 has about 63,000 pounds tractive effort. For a passenger engine, that's pretty good. An 844 can easily start a 70 or 80 car train without any problem at all, and pull it 90 miles an hour. It may take a while to get to 90, but it'll do it.
The 844 was the last steam locomotive that the Union Pacific would buy. That was back in 1944. Steam was king back then, powering some 30,000 locomotives. Today, just 1,800 are left. They fell victim first to diesel, then to the next revolution in transport, the airplane. But they remain special, even to those too young to have seen them firsthand.
You ask a 3-year-old child what sound a train makes, and they've probably never seen a steam engine, and they'll say, woo woo. What's the first book we give our children to read? It's none other than The Little Engine That Could. And it's a very powerful symbol in our culture. It's really part of American folk mythology.
It's an era marked by legendary symbols and names. It's an era that people like Steve Lee won't allow to die. Today, he's an executive with Union Pacific, but for 20 years, he was an engineer. A third-generation train man, Steve's got steam in his blood.
It's something I wanted to do from childhood. I grew up right beside the Illinois Central in a small town there, and the railroad was the biggest presence in the town. And they were still using steam engines up until 1959, and I can still remember those. They made a big impression on a small boy. See people come up and put pennies and nickels and stuff on the track so you can run over them, and those will come out of there like a bullet sometimes. We tell people not to do that, and they say, oh, well, that won't derail the train. No, it won't, but you should see one of those come out of there. It does flatten them, but then it'll throw them out.
Today, the Union Pacific 844 is nearly 50 years old. It's the last mainline steam locomotive that has never been retired. Based in Cheyenne, Wyoming, it comes out for special appearances that never fail to thrill a crowd.
I think a lot of people are just fascinated by the sheer size and the machinery and the craftsmanship and work that went into them.
On this day, it was chugging into Sacramento to join nearly 30 other steam engines for rail fair. Sponsored by the California State Railroad Museum, it's the greatest exhibition of steam locomotives in more than 40 years. A tribute to the relics of the rails.
For our opening in '81, we had a gathering of locomotives from throughout North America and one from England. And for the 10th anniversary, we were determined to do a grand celebration, and this is it.
Plenty of old trains and a few old-fashioned folks. All aboard! There's even a band playing in the town square. This trip back in time is Rail Fair, a celebration of just about everything and anything that ever rode a pair of rails.
Rail Fair consists of an overview of 160 years of railroad history. America has a fascination with railroading, and particularly the steam locomotive.
The older folks, it's nostalgia. For the younger ones, it's history and a first chance to see what old railroading was actually like.
One of my favorites is certainly the Challenger Union Pacific 3985, the largest operating steam locomotive in the world.
The 635,000-pound Challenger may be a legend, but for nearly 20 years it remained in storage, forgotten and unused, until volunteer Union Pacific employees took it upon themselves to restore it. Restoration efforts by organizations and individuals were responsible for most of the engines here at Rail Fair. There are stories behind them all, about the engines and about the people who saved them. The museum restored this one.
This is the old Virginia and Truckee Empire, number 13. It was renumbered by the engine crews because they thought 13 was a little unlucky, and so most of its years it was spent as the number 15. We've restored it back to the way it looked when it was built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1873.
This Virginia and Truckee locomotive, the Inyo, pulled the trains that helped win the West. Built in 1875, it was once headed for the scrap heap. Its rescue is a story straight out of Hollywood.
And it was sold in around 1930s, 38 or something to the movies. And it's probably the only reason it's hanging around now is because of the movies. A lot of the studios saved a lot of locomotives. Most of them have been cut up for scrap.
Today, it's owned by the Nevada Railroad Museum.
It's a 460, a 4-lead wheel, 6 drivers, no trailing trucks. It's what they commonly call a 10-wheeler. That was the nickname. 150 pounds boiler pressure. Its weight is about 50 tons.
The old number 3 was built in 1891 for the Prescott and Arizona Central Railroad. Best known as the Hooterville Cannonball in the 1960s TV series Petticoat Junction, old number 3 also co-starred with Michael J. Fox in the smash feature film Back to the Future 3. Built in 1875, the Eureka was used to haul commodities like lead, silver ore, and coal throughout Nevada. The Eureka was sold in 1939 to Warner Brothers Studios, where it became a locomotive movie star. This sturdy steam engine appeared in such feature films as John Wayne's The Shootist, Finian's Rainbow, and many more.
Throttle, they all have a forward and reverse mechanism, and they all have brakes. They all have a method of putting water in a boiler, and of course they all have to have fuel of some type to create the steam pressure.
This is a wood-fired locomotive, and we throw the wood in here. It's just like a fireplace in the house. Throw it in there, keep all the grates covered, and that heats up your water in your boiler. And then we got your temperature gauge up here. This gives you an idea of what your temperature is. You inject water into here. After your water turns to steam, you lose your water going through the system, and you inject it right here. Similar to that. And my job is to keep the fire going, keep the pressure up, and keep plenty of water in the boiler. And if you lose water in the boiler, you're going to have an explosion more than likely.
We have in the side of the boiler a piece of steel that's referred to as the crown sheet. Under the crown sheet is this tremendous fire. On top of the crown sheet is water. And that sheet has to have the water on the back side of it to keep it from turning bright red. If it becomes bright red, it becomes soft, and the steam pressure will collapse the sheet. And of course, at that point, you have an explosion.
So you have to keep water in the boiler. And we test this glass by what's called blowing down. It clears the glass and makes sure the system is correct and the water bounces back to the level that we want it at.
You keep the water where it belongs. Keep a couple inches in the glass, or like going over the mountains, if you're going in hill country, then you got to keep it to high water. So then when the engine tops a rise, why, if you're going downhill, the water sloshes towards the front of the boiler, and you don't want to expose the rear crown sheet because it don't take long and it's either warped or it's coming apart.
What we call a lubricator. This lubricates the system. It injects valve oil into the system with the steam, and it lubricates all the moving parts so you don't have dry parts that wear out.
You might get a flue or two plug up and front end plug up, and you're not going to get anything. You're going to have to stop, open it up, and scoop that front end out and clean it all out, and then go again.
That's forward, and you pull it back to reverse, and then this is in neutral, called the Johnson bar. Then you have your throttle up here. Once you put your Johnson bar into position, you toot the whistle that you're moving forward with 2 blasts. Then you look around, forward and back, make sure everything's clear, and then you pull the throttle and it starts taking off.
This turn-of-the-century locomotive, the Great Northern 1247, spent 60 years on the tracks for British Rail. Bill Smith was its savior.
In 1959, large numbers of steam locomotives were being scrapped and replaced by diesels. And in fact, this one, the old lady here, she would have been scrapped in another 2 or 3 months had I not made an approach to British Rail to buy it. I remember as a small boy there was no greater excitement than seeing a steam engine at work, and that primarily is why I decided to try and preserve one.
Preserving this engine from the 1920s was a task undertaken by a town, St. Johnsbury, Vermont.
We have a small railroad there. It's about a mile long, and we have about 20 freight cars and this locomotive.
The Los Angeles to San Francisco run was once handled by a slightly bigger engine, the Southern Pacific 4449. The famous engine was active only 15 years.
Southern Pacific donated it to the city of Portland, where it sat in a park for more than 20 years. And it was a Herculean effort that brought it out in 1976.
The 4449 was just one of the 1-inch scale miniatures on display that provided a unique perspective.
You can get an overall view. It's like being in a helicopter 300 feet up looking at these. And the detail on those models is absolutely phenomenal.
Working on a slightly larger scale is Frank Allen, a former sprint car builder who turned to trains when he retired.
I had to build it from scratch. There was no no parts available and no plans available. I had to draw my own plans that I did by coming down and measuring the train in the museum.
It took Frank 8 years to finish. He doesn't want to know how much he spent.
Probably if I figured it out, I'd go jump off a bridge. My wife saw the numbers, I wouldn't have to jump.
In the end, rail fare is more than just engines and trains. It's a reverence for a bygone time, for the bells and the whistles and the clickety-clack of the wheels on the track. For the days when you traveled across the country rather than above it, the people here are united in their love of that time. They want to pass it on, to keep it alive, if only in our minds, so that one day, when space travel is commonplace, future generations will know how it all began.